At what temperature is water considered hot enough to cook?
Okay, this is a very important question. All the questions are important and all very relevant, by the way. And this is a common, when I say important, I mean to say it's a very common and practical halakha that we need to understand. And this also connects to another question that was sent here, which has to do with where is it? Kli Sheni and Shalishi.
There was a question. Yeah, question number 12, maybe.
That's number 12. Why isn't Kli Shalishi sufficient to enable making tea on Shabbat? Is there a real practically applicable concept of Kli Shalishi in halakha? Okay, so these questions are obviously connected. Let us begin at the beginning. Again, we're trying to keep it brief, but we have to understand some of the basics. Hazal discuss the concept of Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. Kli Rishon is the vessel, the pot, in which food is cooked on the fire, on the source of heat, and it remains a Kli Rishon even if you remove it from the heat. So let's say you have a pot of soup. You cook the soup obviously on the fire, so let's say on your gas range. That's a Kli Rishon. Even when you remove it from the fire, or even when you remove it, shall we say, from the hot plate, let's say the chicken soup on Leil Shabbat, that is still a Kli Rishon, because as long as it's very hot, it's still considered a Kli Rishon. A Kli Sheni is when you take the contents of the Kli Rishon, when it's very hot, and pour it into another vessel, as some people do. They take the soup from the pot on Shabbat, or any other day of the week for that matter, and they place it in some kind of large serving bowl, and then they bring it to the table. That's called a Kli Sheni. Why is it a Kli Sheni? Or why does it make a difference if we call it Rishon or Sheni? Because the Sheni is obviously cooler than the Rishon, because it began cool, unless it was somehow heated up beforehand, which is not normally the case. It began cold, you put into it hot soup, so now it becomes hot, but it's not the same heat at all as the Kli Rishon was. And therefore, there is an halachic difference between Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. What is the difference? Kli Rishon is mevashel. Kli Rishon cooks things, and Kli Sheni doesn't cook things. Now, when we speak about cooking things, Hazal, we're referring to the standard things that people cook, that need to be cooked to be eaten. Classic examples: a piece of meat, a potato, onions, etc. All the things that you would put into some kind of cholent, some kind of stew, shall we say, or a soup, or something like that. When you take a piece of meat, let's say a piece of beef or a piece of chicken, and you put it into a Kli Rishon, into a pot, even if it's on the flame, on the boil, it doesn't cook immediately. It takes quite some time to cook, correct? If you were to take that very hot, that boiling pot of water off the flame, it's still very hot, but if you put the meat inside it now, it won't really cook. What might happen is that the kalipa, the outer membrane, the very half a centimeter in thickness on the outside of the piece of meat might become cooked, but the rest of it will not become cooked because it takes some time to do this. The same is true if you take any normal-sized potato and you put it into boiling water. You want to cook a potato, it takes a fair amount of time. It takes something like half an hour to cook a potato in boiling water, at least. If you put it even to a hot pot that was removed from the flame, it won't cook. So generally, but there are certain things that if you put a stick of celery, shall we say, into a very hot pot of soup, which is a Kli Rishon that was removed from the flame or from the plata, and you put into it a raw piece, a stick of celery, you left it there for a while, it might cook to some extent or maybe completely. So a Kli Rishon can cook. A Kli Sheni does not cook. In other words, if you take that same stick of celery and put it in the Kli Sheni, even a stick of celery, it will not cook. It might become a bit softer, but it won't become cooked. Whereas if you speak about a piece of meat or a potato, of course, a Kli Sheni will never cook. It's just not going to happen. So, and therefore, based on that these simple observable realities with which we are all familiar, a Kli Rishon is mevashel, a Kli Sheni is not mevashel, doesn't cook. Now, something that many people do not realize is the following. The concept of a Kli Sheni is an invented concept. In other words, Hazal never speak about it. There's no such thing as a Kli Sheni in the Gemara, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, in the Rambam, or in the Shulchan Aruch for that matter. There's no such thing as a Kli Sheni. It speaks about Kli Rishon and Kli Sheni. However, there is also a certain category of foods known as what we refer to nowadays usually as Kalei HaBishul. Kalei HaBishul means things which are easily cooked. The classic example in the Mishnah, Daf Kof Mem He Amud Bet in Masechet Shabbath, in the Mishnah is, for example, a kind of fish referred to there as Kulias HaIspanin. Some claim this refers to a type of mackerel. It's a kind of fish which does not require to be cooked, to be eaten. All that needs to be done is for it to be held under a stream of hot water which is poured over it. You just pour hot water over this fish because it's small and thin, and that makes it edible. So basically that is its cooking. That's the extent of cooking that is required. That's the example, one of the examples given right there by the Mishnah. The Mishnah states explicitly that you may not, therefore, pour hot water over such a small fish or over some other kind of meat or fish that is very hard, such as some kind of salted product and salted and dried fish or meat. It is inedible at this point in time, but if you pour hot water over it or soak it in very hot water, it will become edible and delicious. And that is the extent of cooking that is required for this particular item. The Mishnah states explicitly that if you do that on Shabbat, you are hayav mishum mevashel min Torah. That is considered cooking min Torah, because cooking is all about preparing something which is either inedible or not in the normal state where we would want to eat it, and preparing it and making it edible and desirable in the normal way by means of heat. As Rambam writes, cooking is, and this applies by the way not only to food, you can cook also metal. That is to say, if you melt metal or you cause a piece of metal to achieve a heat whereby it glows, that is called bishul of that particular kind of metal. In other words, many things can be cooked. Cooking is, the concept of bishul is a very wide-ranging concept. It applies to food and it applies to other materials as well. When we make a change to something, to an item, by way of heat, which makes it more desirable for the purpose for which we require it, that is called bishul. Now, the classic example of something which is kala bishul, which is very easily cooked, are tea leaves. And obviously they are more readily cooked than any kind of small fish or any kind of salted, dried piece of meat or fish that Chazal were referring to in that Mishnah. There is nothing that is as easily cooked, I think, as tea leaves that requires cooking. And it must be pointed out, if one looks in, excuse me, if one looks in the Mishnah Brura in Siman Shin Yod Heth regarding making tea on Shabbat, he never entertains for one moment the notion that you can prepare tea by way of a Kli Sheni. If this were the case, then that would have been that's the simplest solution. What's difficult about a Kli Sheni? You have a meham, you have an urn on Shabbat, you take water from the urn into a glass, that's now a Kli Sheni, because the urn, which is constantly kept hot, is a Kli Rishon. Water in the glass is a Kli Sheni. Pour that into a second glass, that's now Kli Sheni. Put your tea leaves or tea bag into it, and you have a cup of tea. And we all know that works. If you do that, you will have a cup of tea. It won't be as hot as a cup of tea that you prepared during the week, for obvious reasons. It may not be as quite the same taste as the cup of tea you can make on another day of the week, especially if you are a bit of a maven when it comes to tea. But it is definitely a passable cup of tea. It is hot, it tastes like tea, and people manage with it absolutely fine. And if that were a possibility, there would have been nothing simpler for all the Achronim who discuss the making of tea, such as the Hafetz Chaim in the Mishnah Brura, to suggest such a thing. The fact of the matter is, they didn't, for the very simple reason, because there is actually no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Shelishi if in fact the particular thing in question, such as tea leaves, are cooked by either. And the Chazon Ish writes this explicitly, that there is actually no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Shelishi if they both do the job. And we all know they do the job. Now, at this point, I feel I must relate a certain event, a certain anecdotal story that I wish to relate to you. I think it's relevant. About 10 years ago, I was visiting in Australia, and I was staying at a certain person's home, and we were sitting there on Friday night, and at the end of the meal, we wanted tea. And there was another guest in the home from Israel, and when it came to the question of tea, apparently the people of the house had not pre-prepared tea before Shabbat, so I said, I'll have instant coffee or I'll have hot water. That's what I usually say. When there's no pre-prepared tea that was prepared before Shabbat fully, as I will explain in a moment, then I don't drink the tea. I will not drink tea made from a tea bag on Shabbat, in a Kli Sheni, or even a Kli Revi'i for that matter, as I will explain. So this person said, wait a second, why don't you drink from a Kli Sheni? I said, well, I went into it and I explained why. And he said, well, I just bought this book. He actually showed me the book. He was referring to, in fact, I even have the book here and I will show it to you. This is the book right here. If you can see it. Pnine Halacha by Harav Eliezer Melamed, Shabbat Halek Aleph. At that time, I think it was brand new. It just come out. And he said to me, it says here that you can make tea in a Kli Shelishi. So I said, well, let's have a look first what it says. So we had to look at what it says, and that's in fact what it says. And then he said to me, I saw somewhere that the reason that you can make tea in a Kli Shelishi is because water in a Kli Shelishi is not Yad Soledet Bo, because you can put your finger, it's not so hot that you can't touch it. So I said to him, really, that's very interesting. Well, let's try it. Let's make a little experiment. So I went over. This is a home where I've stayed a few times. I'm quite comfortable there. I got up, I went to the cupboard, I took out a tea glass, and I filled it up with some water from the urn, and then I poured it into a second cup, and then I said to him, please put your finger in it, and he did, and then he immediately withdrew his finger together with the exclamation, ouch, because he burned his finger because the water is quite hot. I said, well, you see, therefore, a Kli Shelishi is, generally speaking, usually Yad Soledet Bo, and I'm not even sure you need Yad Soledet Bo to make a decent cup of tea. It might be that 40 degrees, 45 degrees, which is borderline Yad Soledet Bo. Yad Soledet Bo, depending on whom you ask, is anywhere from 45 to 50, 51 degrees. I'm not even sure you need actually Yad Soledet Bo to cook a cup of tea. I will tell you something else that I did last night as an experiment leading up to this question and answer session. Last night after Havdalah, I took a glass of water, cold water, and I placed in it a cheap, very poor, I must add, Vysotsky tea bag, the kind of tea that I never drink, but it's in the cupboard, so it's perfectly good for an experiment. And if you want to hear another time about the quality of such tea, we can discuss that, but that's not the issue at the moment. I took this cheapy Vysotsky tea bag that most Israelis think is really wonderful tea, and I placed it in this cold water, and I let it sit there for 2 hours. After 2 hours, the water had changed color, and I decided to taste it. I can tell you that the taste of tea in the water was almost imperceptible, and the color of the water was certainly darker than it had been at the outset, but it was not, in my opinion, the same color as it would have been had I used boiling water to make a cup of tea, as one normally would. And I went further and I made another experiment. Then I took another tea bag, the same kind, I put it in a glass of water and poured boiling water over it. And then I let it cool down. And then I tasted it. First of all, the color was much darker and the taste was different. It tasted more like cold tea. And then I took that same, and then I also did something further. I took the cold tea, the tea that had only been cold water all along, in which this tea bag had been sitting in cold water, and then I heated it up in the microwave till it boiled. So the water in the glass now boiled, but it never been, but I had removed the tea bag, so it was just the water that had been with the tea for 2 hours, in cold water, but had never been cooked in hot water. Now I just heated up the water and I tasted that. The taste of that water was, there was a almost imperceptible type of flavor of tea to it, but very, very, very weak, very unsatisfactory. Nothing like a cup of tea that you make in a Kli Sheni. The point of all this is to tell you that this is simply a fiction. I can also tell you that in Siman Shin Yod Het Yaroch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yehiel Michel Epstein, a tremendous posek, whose view should always be taken very, very seriously. He writes explicitly with regards to making tea, that tea may be cooked in a Kli Sheni, or even more. If you do cook place tea leaves, he says, in a Kli Sheni, it will definitely become cooked. In other words, he rejects this idea out of hand, similar to the Chazon Ish, who said there's no difference between a Kli Sheni and a Kli Sheni if, in practical terms, they do the same job. And this is exactly what the Mishnah Berurah, the Hafetz Chaim, writes. The Mishnah Berurah writes explicitly that the only way to drink tea on Shabbat is by making the tea beforehand. I don't want to go into all the details now. You can read it there for yourself. In Siman Shin Yod Het, he describes exactly how you can make tea. I agree with everything it says there, except for one minor point, and that is because I explained before that I hold, like most of the Rishonim, like the Rambam, like the Rashba, like the Ran, that something which is liquid but cooked may be reheated on Shabbat. That I therefore have no problem with taking, or let me explain this. What I do is I prepare tea before Shabbat. I take a teapot, I put tea in it, I pour boiling water over it, and it sits there. I do this before Shabbat, a couple of hours before Shabbat, shall we say. On Shabbat, I don't keep it on the hot plate or on top of the urn. I don't keep that hot. That tea, that is cooked tea now. That is now, it's cool. It's like iced tea now, but it's also concentrated. I pour a small amount of that into the cup, and then I add hot water to it. I'm not concerned about cooking the cold tea because it's already been cooked. And the fact that it's liquid, as I said, does not concern me. So that is possible. According to the Mishnah Berurah, who says you can't do that either because it's liquid and it's cold and therefore you can't reheat it. So you have to do the other way around. You would have to put hot water into a Kli Sheni or maybe into a Kli Shlishi even, and then add the tea essence or the concentrated tea into that. There are also those who say you have to keep the teapot on top of the urn or on top of the plata all of Shabbat. As I explained, in my view, that's not necessary. But to claim, the claim that you can make tea in a Kli Shlishi, I believe was first made by Hagaon Rabbeinu Moshe Feinstein. And he does not bring any real proof for this concept at all. And the reality there before our eyes is quite the opposite. And the idea had occurred to the Aruch HaShulchan, and he explicitly rejects it. And I too reject this idea completely.
Thank you, Harav. Binyamin, one of those questions was yours. Do you have anything to have clarified?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.